Well, this is actually April Fool's Day, and so there's no real presentation here. We just wanted to find out who the conservatives on campus were. Actually, so I appreciate being back. I appreciate the hospitality. What I'm going to talk about today is really something of my own personal journey, and you can take from it what you will. I will also note April Fool's Day, 1978, the Hamilton College Speculator was circulated once and only once. I was on the Spectator staff, and we put out a mock, an April Fool's edition, announcing that McDonald's was taking over the dining hall service. And there was absolute panic. And they ended up, the editor of the Spectator ended up running around campus and confiscating our papers because she was so upset that we had done it. She now works for a not-for-profit which develops low-income housing in a, quote, ethnically diverse manner. So that was interesting. But it's really good to be back. One of the things you'll notice is that I do record whenever I speak in public. And maybe at the end of it, I'll tell you why I record when I speak in public. So I think now you'd call me a conservative, maybe a conservative with a streak of libertarian in him. But it didn't really start that way. So the first time I ever got involved in any campaign was for George McGovern when I was 11 or 12 years old. And we went around our neighborhood and handed out flyers for George McGovern. And by the time I got to Hamilton in the fall of 1977, I wouldn't say I was very political, but I think you probably at the time would describe me as a liberal. And because I was liberal, I naturally gravitated towards Kirkland College, which I absolutely adored, and spent a lot of my time over at Kirkland. And Kirkland for me, and maybe this is just because things always seem better when it's 30 years ago or 35 years ago than they do now, but Kirkland to me was one of those great liberal places of free thinkers and people who were thinking outside the box. And it was very artsy, and we used to, joke about the hippie chicks and all that. The Hamilton side was a lot more conservative and a lot more straight-laced, and it was an interesting mix. But to me, I always thought of liberals as kind of the Kirkland side, or at least what the Kirkland side was back then. And so I like to think that I never left liberalism. I think liberalism in many ways left me. And, that individual autonomy that was in fashion back then, doing your own thing, keeping the government off your back, that sort of thing never really left me. So when I was at Hamilton, I came here and we merged schools in my sophomore year. So when I came here, it was Hamilton, male, Kirkland, female. Kirkland essentially went out of business, and Hamilton absorbed Kirkland. I majored in Russian studies. I had taken Russian in high school and went with Hamilton to the Soviet Union for January term. I guess you don't have the January term anymore. That was a great thing. So we went there in January. Then I did language programs at Middlebury College over the summers in Russian and went with Middlebury for a semester in Moscow in my junior year. And so that was really, I think maybe one of the awakenings for me, seeing how the Soviet system operated, living there, understanding how they really crushed the individual through explicitly and implicitly through regulation, through monitoring everything, through requiring you to get a permit for everything, and through control of the economy. And so that was probably one of my first awakenings. The biggest awakening for me, or biggest change, probably occurred after I left Hamilton. So in 1980, when I was still here, I was for Carter against Reagan. In fact, I was for Kennedy against Carter. And I remember sitting in one of the rooms on this side watching the election returns that night come in, and the conservative students were there cheering, and we were like, oh, I can't believe it. I can't believe that Ronald Reagan's going to win. But by 1980, '84, I was solidly for Ronald Reagan. And I think what probably pushed me over is that whereas, Kirkland, or growing up in high school, and Kirkland was kind of that what I would call the fun, nice side of liberalism. When I got to Harvard Law School, I saw the not so nice side of liberalism, the nasty side of liberalism. Harvard Law School at the time was dubbed by some writer as Beirut on the Charles because of the fight between the critical legal thinking movement and the traditional academics at Harvard Law School. But what I most specifically ran into was the left-wing joining with anti-Israel forces on campus, and really bringing forward kind of a very anti-Israel position. And that, to me, I said, well, wait a second here. Why are these liberal students joining up with, it wasn't really Islamists at the time, it was more secular but virulently anti-Israel Palestinians, and why were they joining up with these people? And that, to me, so by the time I left Harvard, I think I would have, again, probably described myself as a conservative by that point in time, although I was not very political outside of the Israel sort of context. I didn't get involved in politics very much. And so I graduated law school in 1984, and I did what most people in the world do. You go to work, and you work long hours, and you work hard. It was not political at all. So from the time I graduated law school in 1984, really up until a few years ago, completely non-political. That doesn't mean I didn't have views. That doesn't mean I didn't have opinions. But they were things I kept to myself. I mean, one of the things you learn is, particularly if you're working in New York, like I was, New York City, for the first 9 years out of law school, and then Rhode Island, is that it's not good for business to be conservative. It's really not. And it's also not good for business on campus in many ways, or in academia. But that was, so I just kept my head down. I mean, I did my thing, built my legal practice, did my own, eventually started my own law firm. And, I was a registered I was a registered Democrat in New York when I lived here, but when I went to Rhode Island, as part of my escape from New York, I registered as Republican, but completely non-political. I don't even know if we donated money to anybody. I don't even think we donated $100 to any political candidates, because it just wasn't worth the risk of running into, in Rhode Island, a very, very democratic state, through and through, and so it just wasn't worth it. And continued to do my thing. In 2007, I joined Cornell Law School in the fall of 2007, completely non-political. Did not, express a view, I had opinions again, but not really involved whatsoever. Then, in 2008, I began to see this stuff happening, what I think you could call Obama mania, this hysteria, this mass delusion, the media completely abrogating its responsibility to fact-check, to vet, to question, and really becoming cheerleaders. And I began to get very, very frustrated. And I began to say, kind of, what is happening here? We've known that the media always tilts to the left, and that's fine, and maybe that's just the nature of it. But it was so far gone in 2008 that I really began to get very frustrated. And something else started to happen during 2008 that I found very troubling, and that was the use of the race card as a political weapon. That if you came out against Obama on substance, you were a racist. And I took great offense to that, because I was as proud as anybody that we'd reached a place in the country that we could nominate a black person for president and a political party. So I was as happy about that. But I opposed what he stood for. I opposed his policies. I also felt that I knew him because we both went to Harvard Law School. I didn't know him. We weren't there at the same time. But I knew him, okay? I grew up with these people. I went to law school with him, and I knew that he was more progressive than he was letting on, and I knew that he was didn't really have the world experience for the job, that he had really come through a very political sort of route rather than an economic route or some other accomplishment. So I just began getting very, very frustrated, but I kept my mouth quiet. Didn't say a word, didn't do a thing. Then one day, I'm back in Rhode Island. We have a house in both places. We never moved out of Rhode Island. So when school's not in session, I'm back in Rhode Island. So I want to say it must have been either late August or I think it was mid-September of 2008 at a former client's house with my wife, and we're having dinner. And he was a former client but had become a friend. And we had probably known each other for 10 years at that point, maybe even a little bit more. And not once had we ever discussed politics. Not once. So we're sitting, we're having dinner, and all of a sudden he says, "Who are you going to vote for?" So, well, I'm voting for John McCain and Sarah Palin. And we got into the biggest argument. And it went on for about an hour, back and forth. How could you vote for this? How could you do this? She's an idiot, blah, 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 back and forth. And finally, at the end of it, he said to me, I've never heard anybody explain that side the way you have. He said, I don't agree with you still, but I've really never heard anybody just lay it out like that. And so he said, you should start to write. You should maybe go get a blog. And at that point in time, not being political, I had no idea what a blog was. I didn't go to websites. And so I started to look into it. And so I opened this thing called Legal Insurrection. And the first post was October 12th, 2008. And I was so naive that first of all I went to this thing called Google Blogger because it was free and I didn't know any better and I could actually use it. And I also used my own name. It never even dawned on me that I could just make up a name and write that way. Long American tradition of doing that. But it never even dawned on me. Maybe because I had not had an academic background and realized what that entails. So I just started writing, and I picked this name. So I said, the way I was feeling was so frustrated. I was feeling, the word insurrection came to mind. And I looked it up in the dictionary, and by definition, it's illegal. So I said, well, that's probably not the best thing for me to name the blog. So I said, how about legal insurrection? And that's how I got Legal Insurrection. And I don't know if anybody here has ever visited it, but I just literally took the lettering from the dictionary. So we've got a somewhat unique lettering where the syllables are separated by dots. It looks like a dictionary definition. Of course, I just copied and pasted in. So the first post that I did was October 12th, 2008, and the title of it was Obama is Door Number 2. And the thesis of it was that we really don't know him, that we really don't know a lot about him, that he hasn't had the life experience in the public to really give us a clue as to what he would do as president. And the second or third post I wrote a couple of days later was Race as a Political Weapon. The thesis being, or the conclusion being, the suppression of legitimate political expression through false accusations of racism by the Obama campaign and its supporters is the defining theme of the 2008 campaign. This tactic, while it may be successful, is shameful and has damaged our society in ways we may not understand for years. And then the third or fourth or fifth or sixth post I wrote, which actually I wrote for another online journal, was called A Harvard Trial Lawyer for McCain, in which I laid out why, if you look at my background, I should be an Obama supporter. I mean, I went to an Ivy League law school. I'm teaching at an Ivy League law school. I should be, and I laid out why I was not. And it's many of the things that I discussed here. And that's when I realized, well, there's a price to pay when you use your own name and you express a view that is either conservative, I would just call it realistic, but is not in keeping with what's typical on campuses and what's typical in the media. And the price you pay is nasty letters. The price you pay is complaints to your school about you. And I'm not talking about crazy stuff that I said. I mean, I didn't call the victims of 9/11 of the towers little Eichmanns. I mean, I'm just writing policy things saying, here's why I don't support this candidate. And it really was truly astounding. And so that was really, kind of the theme of today, of coming out on campus and what does it really mean. And, I've gotten a lot of taste of that. I mean, certainly I think liberal professors get complaints, but it's usually oriented, at least from what I've seen, around a particular event or statement. There's the professor down in Florida who had the students stomp on Jesus on the floor, write down Jesus and stomp on. I mean, that's an event. But in my experience, liberal professors don't face that merely for expressing kind of like day-to-day sort of liberal positions. Whereas conservatives on campus do face that to come out. I mean, I have a number of people who would like to write for my blog who will not do it because they don't have tenure yet where they're teaching. And I have one person in particular who says, I'm up for tenure next October. As soon as I get it, I want to start writing for you, but I cannot risk it. Now, I think that I'd be surprised if there is that level of fear throughout liberal academia, that if you are a liberal professor and you don't have tenure, that you are going to shy away from expressing completely routine liberal positions on the blogosphere. But if you're a conservative professor, you live in fear that if you do express routinely conservative positions, nothing crazy, nothing outlandish, that there's going to be retaliation against you. Whether that's just perceived or real, I can't tell you, but I do know that there's a great amount of fear out there. I also have a number of students who would like to write for my blog. From time to time, I do have students write for the blog. In fact, in the early days of the blog, there was a junior at Cornell who wrote almost daily. And she got all these fellowships, the Wall Street Journal, et cetera, et cetera. So she had kind of cast her lot that was going to be her career path. But students who don't want to go that career path, who just want to go work for a company, I always have the conversation with them. If you're going to put your name on it, you have to understand that nothing comes off the internet, and if you're going to write come out against a particular policy of the Obama administration, that someday somebody's going to interview you, and they're going to look you up on the internet, and they're going to see that, and they're going to see that you wrote at a conservative blog, and you have to think through whether there are any ramifications for that. And I'd say most of the time the students think it through and they say, no, I just don't feel I can risk it. They talk to their parents, etc. And, so that's something that, again, I don't think there are very many liberal students. I mean, the students on campus better than I do, but in my observation, liberal students never hesitate to come out and express their views, and they shouldn't. But conservatives are always very cautious. They're always trying to figure out, what can I say, what can't I say, and what will the ramifications be. And that's something that I've seen a lot at College Insurrection. As mentioned, we opened in August. College Insurrection, it's essentially an aggregator of content from student journals and about things that are going on campuses. And, so that sort of confirms my interaction with students, that there is this level of fear and this fear of being subject to retaliation. I also have that with readers, that a lot of times readers will send me things. They'll email me, and they'll say, please don't use my name because I don't want people at my company to find out, because they're afraid there'll be retaliation against them at the company if somebody were to see that they were doing something conservative. And that's very, very frequent. So, it's just, what does it mean to come out as a conservative on campus? I think what it means is that you have to have more guts than your fellow students. You have to have more self-confidence. It also means that you have to think through what you're going to say and how you're going to say it more than others do, because you are going to be targeted for one of the isms or one of the ists or whatever it happens to be. And that's the reason why I record when I speak in public, because I don't know who's here. I'm speaking in public. Anything I say is fair game. But I want a record of what I said. So if somebody were to come back at me and accuse me of something, and they do, I said, well, no, actually, I have the recording. Here's what I actually said. And therefore, I think that that's one of the lessons that I've learned through this process, is that if you're going to be a conservative, particularly in academia or on campus, you're always being watched, and you're always being targeted, and you're always having to justify what you say. And therefore, I've come to a writing style which is not really natural, but I always think, how could somebody twist what I'm saying to try to marginalize me? Is there a clause in the sentence, if taken in isolation, could be misconstrued? To my credit, perhaps it's because of my lawyer's background, nobody's been successful at that, but that's not to say they haven't tried. And so it's just a very, very awkward way of living, frankly, but it's something that I found to be absolutely necessary. The issue on campuses, as I see it, is they've essentially been lost to the progressives. And I don't want to open any wounds at Hamilton College, but I often joke that Hamilton didn't absorb Kirkland. It was actually the other way around. And that what happened is that Hamilton and most liberal arts colleges, which had a very traditional sort of focus, both in academia and socially and in the student body, have essentially become progressive institutions. And those progressive institutions, be they through speech codes, through other sorts of things, and I strongly encourage you to follow a website called The Fire. I forget what the FIRE acronym stands for, but it's a group which is nonpartisan, it's not liberal, it's not conservative, but addresses speech code issues on campuses. And those, if you look through their website and the cases they get involved in, they actually have been involved at Hamilton, it's almost always an attempt to suppress what we would loosely call conservative speech on campus. I mean, it's never called that, but it always seems to be used that way. And so I think that there are real problems for students on campuses. But what I've also observed, and I think I've seen a change even over the last 5 years. I've been doing the blog now for 4.5 years. I think things are changing. I mean, I think people have become conscious of the negative atmosphere on campus for conservatives, and there's a lot more pushback now in the last year or two than I noticed in the early part. In fact, there are a lot of organizations now which foster conservative groups on campus, which there are a lot more publications which follow what goes on campus. If you go to my blog, we've got a blog roll of organizations and publications which follow what happens on the campuses. And I think that there's a lot more focus, and conservative students are becoming a lot more vigorous on campuses. They're still a minority, a small minority, but they are a more vocal minority, and they're a more organized minority. And in fact, that's one of the things that we hope to accomplish through college insurrection. So what does it mean to be a conservative on campus these days? It doesn't mean what it probably meant 15 or 20 years ago. It's not really a social conservatism movement, although there certainly is a pro-life component there. I'd say it's kind of what I was back when I was at Hamilton. I think it's a more libertarian-leaning sort of movement. It's a more independence from government, type of movement. It's free-spirited, free-thinking sort of movement. It's coming out against the oppressiveness of the state or the administration on campus through these speech codes and other ways. And so I actually am fairly hopeful about what's happening on campuses for the conservative/libertarian movement. I think there have been some positive developments in the last couple of years. I think that the development of the Tea Party movement, as much as it's been demonized unfairly, I think is a very positive movement. And the Tea Party movement is in many ways a libertarian sort of movement. It's not a social conservative movement. And so I'm actually pretty upbeat about what's happening on the campuses. I think that there's finally a recognition that most of the campuses, at least liberal arts schools, were lost to the progressive movement. And I'm actually, thinking pretty positively about that. So kind of the end of my comments, to the extent they're prepared comments, is, my journey, I think, is a journey a lot of people take, but perhaps they're smarter and they use a pseudonym. But I think that people like the fact that I'm out there with my own name, even if it does mean that I get people trying to get me fired. I've done a lot of work on the Elizabeth Warren campaign last summer, a lot of research on her. That has engendered a lot of hostility and a lot of emails and a lot of harassment. But I think it's all worth it. And I would simply encourage the students here, and I realize we have some, obviously, people who are not students here, but I would encourage the students to think through what you're doing, to be very cautious about it, but not to back away from it, and not to, shy away from any sort of controversy and from what you believe in, because ultimately, we're all facing retirement age either now or pretty soon. I mean, it's your country. Yeah, it's not ours in a sense, and it's your future. And I would strongly encourage you to speak out, but I would also encourage you to do it in an intelligent way and in a way which is somewhat defensive. So with that, I'm going to stop my comments. I have a feeling there might be some questions here heading my way, hopefully.
I can actually raise an interesting one about the Elizabeth Warren campaign. You may not know that on our board of academic advisors is one of the most prominent Democratic attorneys in the United States today, Mark Elias, who's one of my former students and a Hamilton graduate. And of course, Mark was responsible for litigating the disputed election in Minnesota, which got Al Franken the position. And of course, it was Mark who was doing a lot of Democratic troubleshooting for Elizabeth Warren in Massachusetts as well.
Okay, great. Question?
Problem that I've encountered with my personal experience, when I came to college, I was non-conservative. I was definitely left-leaning. The problem that I've experienced is that people have sort of an idea of what a conservative is in their heads, and it is sometimes accurate and sometimes not. And that is what, in my experience, has shut down political conversation. Because you express a view that is libertarian, conservative, whatever, and people come back at you with, you are a racist and you are these things, whatever. All these stereotypes. And how have you dealt with those? Have you experienced similar things? And how have you challenged them? And have you been successful?
Yeah. Well, I think that is very common, because if you're going to put a label on somebody, it's a way to avoid discussing the issue. So I don't think that you have to be defensive about it. I think you simply say, on what basis are you saying that I'm racist? What is the evidence that you have, or you're just accusing me? And then you can explain it. So I think one thing that you probably face on campus a lot is the issue of affirmative action. And the crazy point we've come to is that to express the view that we should judge people based on the content of their character, not the color of their skin, is likely to get you accused of being a racist. Of course, I'm referring to Martin Luther King, but everything's so politicized that I don't think people really think through. In fact, if you made that comment to somebody, I bet you most of them wouldn't even know who said that. And so I think what you have to do is, unfortunately, you can't deal with the media puts those labels on people. there's only so much you can do, but I think all you can do is try to explain to people why you're not, and what is your evidence that I am? What have I said that leads you to make that accusation? Now, most of my interactions are frankly through the internet. So you do have a little bit of a chance to frame your response, as opposed to somebody in person where you've got to think very quickly and be. But I think, what is it? What is it that I've said that, and I think that there are a lot of other issues where the mere expression of a dissenting view will get a label put on you.
I'm a little confused about what a conservative really is. Some of the positions taken by conservatives, like right to life, seem to me very radical and not conservative at all.
Well, I do think that there has been a merging in the last few years of what you would call traditional conservative, which I think includes the state having a purpose to promote certain values, with libertarian, which is essentially the state should stay out of it. So I agree with you. I think nowadays it's somewhat muddled, and that's why I say a lot of the positions that I take and might call conservative, and others would call conservative, I think 40 years ago might have been called liberal. True liberal, not the power of the state used to enforce a viewpoint, but just the opposite. So I agree with you. I think it's nowadays, I'd be curious if somebody else has a view, I think those lines have become a little muddled, in part because I think the libertarian movement is probably bigger now. I mean, it's not a majority, but it's more influential now than it was 10 years ago. I mean, 10 years ago, libertarians were just viewed as kooks.
Yeah, you alluded to the fact that Hamilton was more or less absorbed into Kirkland as opposed to vice versa. But how much of, at least this most recent hypersensitivity to diversity and things like that is caused by the current administration that's in office, and the derisiveness of the haves versus the have-nots, and that kind of trickling down to a college campus, as opposed to something an agenda that's been set in motion in the case of Hamilton since 1979.
Yeah. Well, I think things have gotten worse in the last 4.5 years, and I think it's because the politics of race has been used not to promote civil rights, which is the way it traditionally was used, but it's been used to promote a particular political party over another. So I think things have gotten worse in the last 4. I can't speak to, what goes on the campus here, but I think just in general, I think things have become worse. But nothing happens overnight. I mean, I think that there has been, a change in most educational institutions over the last 40 years. So I think, trying to answer your question, I think things are worse now, but I think it was a generation in the making. I don't think it just happened overnight. And you talk about the hypersensitivity to diversity. Again, I think that that's a good example of how you can very easily get yourself labeled racist for wanting to treat everybody equally. I mean, how crazy is that? You want to treat everybody equally as an individual, base your decisions on their individual merits, and that position is likely to get a label put on you. That didn't happen in the last 4 years. I mean, that's been a generation in the making.
So, you bring up merit. I'm curious what you mean by merit. In terms of the test scores, or what you mean by merit. I think one of the issues that comes up is people are conflating race and class together. So oftentimes they correlate. They're not the same thing, but oftentimes when people say based on the merit, that means test scores and things like that. And it's a large issue because you do want to give everybody a chance, but if you're picking the people that have the highest scores and treating them as if they have merit, whether they do or not, then there's going to be some people that don't get a chance. I'm curious how you kind of view that.
Well, I mean, the Supreme Court has said that you have to be very circumscribed in your use of race as a factor in admissions. You don't necessarily have to exclude it completely, but using it for the sake of using it is not permissible. I think that where you're going is exactly where things are heading, which is the recognition that economic advantage growing up in 2013, maybe not in 1963, but in 2013, is probably a much more influential factor than the color of your skin. That's not to say color of your skin doesn't affect anything, but I think that's where things seem to be heading, and I think that people are becoming more and more sensitive to that in admissions, and I think when we get a decision in case pending before the Supreme Court, I think you're going to see the ability to use race in admissions drawn back even further than it is now. I think when the key decisions came down 25 or 30 years ago, the Supreme Court justices openly wondered, are we going to still need this sort of system 25 or 30 years from now? And I think in 2 months we'll find out whether they think we still need it. But I think that, there's, I think that economic-based analysis, that class-based analysis as a reason to give someone affirmative action, that maybe they don't have the test scores because they grew up in a poor neighborhood, regardless of the color of their skin. Maybe their parents were disadvantaged, maybe neither of their parents were educated, that those sort of things will be taken into account, but not the color of their skin.
As a matter of fact, there have been people on the right, like Dinesh D'Souza, there are a number of people who are identified as right of center who push a class-based affirmative action program.
I was going to comment kind of what you were just talking about with the double standard with, like, if you disagree with Obama, you're racist. But if you disagree with Ben Carson, you can say whatever you want. You can say whatever you want about what's his name? That ran for pizza guy.
Herman Cain.
Herman Cain, right. But they just vilified that man.
Yeah.
But if we did that, if the conservative did that, I mean, you know where that goes.
Yeah, I mean,
Is there any way to get over that?
MSNBC just ran a graphic and the headline of their segment about Dr. Ben Carson. I think it was titled "Frightened by the White," basically saying that his positions are, because he's giving in to the white man. And this is MSNBC. I mean, this is a major cable network where if anything similar had been done by Fox News, I mean, there only is Fox News. There's, there would be an absolute uproar. And I think that it's really kind of outrageous, and people, and MSNBC just gets away with it.
Do you think they'll ever get called on it, though, ever?
I don't think so. I really don't. But that's indicative of the double standard, that criticizing a substantive policy gets you labeled racist, but accusing a black conservative of selling out to the white man will not get you labeled anything. And in fact, will probably get you a primetime slot at MSNBC. So it's really a crazy situation.
What do you see as the impact of legal insurrection after 4.5 years?
Well, I don't know. Had anybody here heard of it? Okay, one. So obviously not enough of an impact. We're a small part-time blog. I mean, we're not Huffington Post. We don't have staff. We don't have payroll. We don't have any of those things. It is, I think, and I'm proud of it in many ways, a great blogospheric story that you have a bunch of people in their spare time, and spare time means staying up till 1 a.m. and getting up at 6, but in their spare time who put this together. And we tend to get deeper into issues than a lot of other things. So we will focus on a political race, and we'll write about it almost every day until the election. or mostly it's me, will take some issue and write a very in-depth sort of post about it that you don't normally see. So I'd like to think that for the, I mean, we get, it's a little lower now, but we have been getting close to 1 million unique visits. That doesn't mean 1 million people. That means 1 million, it's a statistic. Over 1 million page views. My guess is it's probably 200,000 to 250,000 people who are visiting, the way they measure things. That I think they, based on their comments and the emails I get, they look to our blog for some hope that, a lot of people are very depressed after the last election. They thought it might be winnable, and it turned out not to be. And a lot of people, come to my blog because they see a small group of people who continue to fight on and who have not given up. And in fact, we're probably going to be getting more aggressive in the coming years. And so I think the impact is that we've kept hope alive for a lot of people, for tens of thousands of people who visit it. And I'm just saying that based on the emails I get and the comments we get. One thing I've learned is that, it's very easy to feel that things are just too overwhelming. When you have the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, when you have every single major newspaper, with the exception of the Wall Street Journal, being very left-leaning, when you have most of the television being very left-leaning, with Fox being the exception, we do have talk radio, I'll grant you that. But I think a lot of people just feel it's overwhelming. There's no chance. We can't change anything. And so the focus that we've made for this coming year, and I announced it the day after the election, or 2 days after the election, is that we're going to try to focus on the things we can make a difference on. So we're going to focus more on local elections, we're going to focus more on state elections, and we'll focus more on congressional races. Because the national stuff, it just seems overwhelming. I mean, it really does. I mean, look at the operation that Obama put together for the last 4 years to win this election. I mean, technologically, logistically, in terms of messaging, was so far superior to anything we'd ever seen before. People just feel, I can't even deal with this. I can't. It's hopeless. But if you focus on your local race, if you focus on your local Senate, state Senate, if you focus on the governor races, these are things where you can make a difference. And that's one of the themes that we're pushing, is to win what you can win. And things at the national level at this stage are really just damage control. So I think that's been our impact. I think that we, with college insurrection, hopefully that word will get out a little better. We did have kind of a marketing plan for it to do student outreach, but I completely underestimated how all-consuming the election would be. And so we rolled out college insurrection in August and immediately did not have the time we really needed to get the word out there. But, we do what we can do. I mean, like I said, we're not the New York Times, and we're not CBS News, and we're not Huffington Post that gets, 3 million people a day or whatever they get. So we do what we can do, and I think that's the message that we try to send out to people, is do what you can do, but whatever you do, don't give up.
One of the interesting things that you brought up was you went to Harvard Law. A few years after you left Harvard Law, Barack Obama went to Harvard Law, and you said you recognized certain things. Can you talk a little bit about the culture of Harvard Law and what Barack Obama may have extracted during his time as a law student there?
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously I can't speak to him personally, who he interacted with, because I wasn't there at the time. But there was a very big critical legal studies movement at Harvard, which is essentially, fighting against the traditional notions of law and justice and things like that, and turning things into a much more political type of movement. And I think that had, if it hadn't taken over the faculty, it was extremely strong on the faculty by the time he got there. there was very nasty politics at the law school, which, as far as I can tell, continued for at least a decade after I left. So that would have been the time that he was there. Issues of race, issues of faculty hiring. One story I had mentioned to you, which was just appalling to me. It was, I think, a year or two after I graduated. I think it might have been the only black tenured professor left to go to Columbia. That was a big deal. And the school, on a temporary basis, hired 2 adjunct professors to cover the civil rights course that he taught. One of those professors was a very prominent, and I'm just forgetting his name right now, black civil rights attorney. And the other person hired to co-teach that course was somebody by the name of Jack Greenberg. And Jack Greenberg is a white Jewish guy who was one of the founders of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, was on the brief in Brown v. Board of Education, had litigated some of the most famous civil rights cases. I mean, truly a giant in the civil rights movement. And there were vicious protests on campus that they'd appointed a white man to co-teach that course. It was all over the newspapers, all over the Harvard Crimson. Alan Dershowitz got involved. Nasty, nasty fight. I mean, does that make any sense to anybody that would happen in Harvard Law School? And it did happen. Fortunately, I've saved the clippings from back then. You probably would. You can search Jack Greenberg Harvard Law School controversy, and you'll find out about it. And that was the atmosphere on campus. It was just everything was political. Even co-teaching a course where one of the people was a giant in the legal field on behalf of civil rights. And there was this political nature to it. And so just the atmosphere there. And then there was, when I said that I didn't know him, but I knew him, I wasn't referring to that. I was referring to, there's a lot of very successful people coming out of law school who are very book smart. I mean, they've done very well in school. They can write a great brief, but they have no real life experience. And they haven't really achieved anything in their life other than this academic success. And I question that as a basis to become president of the United States. And that's really what I was referring to, that I knew the type who were very book smart, who had their ideas, but really had no life experience, and had never really accomplished anything other than advancing themselves. And that's what I was referring to when I said I didn't know him personally, but I kind of knew him. And that's one of the things that led me to be very concerned about him becoming president, that you've got these brilliant ideas that are completely impractical in the world. I think we're going to find that out with Obamacare. Then we're going to find out what a disaster it's going to be. Not because there aren't necessarily good ideas, but one of the things I learned studying Soviet economics is that central control never works. Central planning never works. But it's a great idea, and people fall in love with that concept. In fact, one thing, I don't know if it's on my resume or not, but my senior year at Hamilton, I did a senior fellowship. So I just spent the entire year producing a paper, and the subject was Soviet and Chinese economic aid to Africa and how their own economic models influenced the type of aid they gave to Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. And, one of the things I learned is 5-year plans never work. And Obamacare is not going to work because it doesn't take into account human nature. I mean, I just had dinner 2 weeks ago with a doctor who's 56 years old, and he says, I see what's coming down. I can't take it now, all the rules and regulations. He says, my peer group, we're planning our exit strategy. How many more years once the Obamacare regulations come into place, and they've got to hire somebody in their medical practice just to keep track of the regulations. He said, I'm done. I'm retiring. And so, brilliant idea. No, I won't say it's a brilliant idea. A smart academic sort of idea. Let's reorganize the healthcare system. And we're going to have all these different requirements. And it doesn't take into effect real life. That people aren't going to work when you impose this excessive regulation on them. You're going to turn the country into the Soviet Union, not politically, but economically, where people figure what is worth doing and what's not worth doing, and they figure out sooner or later there's a lot of stuff that's not worth doing because taxes are too high, regulations are too high, it's just not going to work. And this notion that incapable of understanding that individual initiative can be a positive thing. It's not something that needs to be stamped out. And so that's the sort of person I went to law school with. I mean, those were people, they're all liberals now, virtually. And they're all very prominent. And they've got these ideas which I don't think are going to work, and I don't think his ideas are going to work.
You mentioned taxes. Gregory Mankiw, economic advisor to Romney, he has come out in support of sort of a carbon tax. Do you think that in the near future you could see conservatives ever backing any sort of, tax in that, same sort of light?
I mean, I haven't studied the carbon tax or his writings on it, so I can't really comment on him. I think that taxation, people, it affects behavior. I think, so if you're going to tax something, if you're going to make the cost of doing something more expensive for people, they'll figure out a way around it. But I'm not familiar enough with his specific writing on that to comment.
So you mentioned all these regulations with Obamacare, right? We've made a lot of regulations, but how far the other way do you need to go? Are you talking no regulations? So, what's your position there? I don't want to build a straw man, but you're saying this is too much regulation. How much is enough?
Well, I think you go to a system where you empower the individual. That's my personal view.
Right, and I think there are issues with that just because some corporations are very powerful as well, right? And they are not working in the individual's best interest either. And they can cause some of the same problems that large government can, particularly when they write the laws, like this Monsanto law that just was signed by President Obama.
Well, you've thrown a lot of concepts in there. You've asked my view of where we need to go with the healthcare system. My view is that we need to empower individuals to become consumers the way they're consumers for everything else. And that what you have now is a model where cost makes no difference to the consumer of most of the consumers, because you have insurance and it really doesn't matter to you. 80%, 85% of the population had insurance, okay? And I think that's a bad model. I think some sort of model where, and it may require subsidies, where people are given the equivalent of a health savings account. They're protected against catastrophic losses, okay? But within and where you set that, I understand, I think could be in dispute. But if you're going to pick $5,000-$6,000 as what people have to absorb, you empower them through health savings accounts to cover that, to be wise shoppers, to shop around the way they do for everything else, because if they don't spend it all, they get to keep some of it. And then you have some sort of incentivized insurance so that nobody loses their house because they go into a hospital. But for the bulk of our services, not emergency room, because nobody plans to go there, but for the bulk of your day-to-day healthcare services, you have been empowered and you're protected against catastrophic losses. That, to me, is a system which would help keep down costs without necessitating, if you've seen the hand truck they're wheeling around Washington, the Obamacare regulations are already 7 pages high and they're not done. 7 feet high and they're not done. You wouldn't necessarily need all of those regulations. So
you end up with a situation like where there's only a couple of companies offering service, like with cell phones, right? They deregulated those in the 90s, and all of a sudden, all the beta bells came back together, right? You now have AT&T again, and you have Verizon, and that's about it. What do we do then? If, say, all these regulations went away and we were empowered consumers, but there's Blue Cross Blue Shield and like Athena Healthcare, and that's it.
Well, I think that you could create more of a national market for healthcare. I think that, no system's going to be perfect, but the question is whether you're going to deal with the system which imposes such regulatory paperwork. Forget what it accomplishes, just the paperwork. I mean, I come from a family, my wife's family, of physicians. And as much as that person I went to dinner with complains, they complain about how burdensome this is going to become. And so I don't know that there's a perfect system, but I think trying to create the equivalent of a 5-year plan for the healthcare system, I think is not going to work.
Before we let you go, I'd like to put you on the spot if I can, Counselor. What do you, with your vast experience here with your blog and the feedback you're receiving, I'd like to ask you if you'd like to, maybe you don't want to, but could you make a forecast for a year and a half, a little better than a year and a half, the interim election? How do you think that's, are we going to hold the House? Do we have a chance for the Senate? What do you think? You don't have to.
I don't want to answer because I don't, for the same reason, I don't tell people what I wished for when I blow out birthday candles. I can tell you what I think relatively objective people are saying. And what they're saying is that because of redistricting, because so few House seats are competitive anymore, that it's going to be extremely difficult for the Democrats to take back the House. Things happen, okay? But that apparently is going to be extremely difficult. I think the Senate is, from what people are saying, is going to be a closer call. I think that you've had some Democrats retire who were not expected, which helped the Republicans. The senator, I forget if it was from South or North Dakota, just announced he was going to be retiring. That's a seat that is likely, nothing's given, to turn Republican, and was not expected 6 months ago. So I think that political analyses that are kind of down the middle are saying it's very likely Republicans will hold the House. They might lose a few seats, but likely they're going to hold it. And it's going to be a very close call about the Senate.